Hi. In 2016, I was new to the Senate. My stance against climate fraud and unfounded climate alarm was clear in the campaign leading to the 2016 federal election. Within the first week or so of being in the Senate, the ABC invited me onto its three flagship programs, Insiders, Late Line, and QandA, trying to pressure me. They even brought out science communicator Brian Cox to open a Q&A program challenging my views. I want to thank sincerely the many, many people who've written to me complimenting me for standing up for science and the way I did it. I remind everyone that the term climate change, in terms of the claim that humans are changing the world's climate, is based on the claim that carbon dioxide from human use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, is causing unprecedented, ongoing, catastrophic global warming, and our use of hydrocarbon fuels must be cut. So let's begin the video of the Q&A session with Brian Cox.
There are a lot of questions in the audience. Brian, you've anticipated pretty much the next one. It's from Susie Wakefield.
Hello. Recently on Insiders, Malcolm Roberts gave Barry Cassidy his business card and asked Barry to get back to him when he had proof and data that there is a human element in our increasing climate change. I was hoping the panel could perhaps guide Barry with some fact and just not opinion on the human element in climate change.
I was going to start with...
By the way, Barry did reply to me. His reply contained misunderstandings of scientific proof, showed complete ignorance. There's no empirical scientific data within logical scientific points. There was no proof of cause and effect, no evidence that we need to cut our use of miracle hydrocarbon fuels.
Brian Cox, the scientist on the panel, and can you provide scientific data or evidence that might help Barry Cassidy convince Malcolm over here that human-induced climate change is a reality?
Well, Brian Cox is a physicist and a muso. He's a media talking head, paid to discuss the narrative and put forward the narrative. He's not someone with a meteorology degree or a geology expert. Being a scientist in one discipline doesn't make that person an expert on everything just because they're on national TV. Academic qualifications do not define who is a scientist. Not a BSc, not an MSc, not a PhD. Instead, a scientist is someone who follows the scientific process or method in researching or investigating natural science. The show started with Brian Cox because he wanted that topic established, and seems I was their target to debunk. So bring it on.
Well, yes, and I could sit here and read out figures until I'm blue in the face. I mean, interestingly, it's getting more worrying if you look at the temperature measurements now. I mean, 2015 and 2016 in particular have seen a quite shocking acceleration in many of the measures, be it surface temperatures, ocean temperatures, etc. So the first few months I noticed of 2016 have above the average, the pre-industrial average, have been pushing 1.5 degrees. Now, you can't read too much into individual years. You have to be careful because you see these graphs and they're spiky, but there's a clear rise. And
the latest data is actually suggesting that by 2024, 1.5 degree increase is on the cards now, which puts us very close to the critical 2%.
And that's a prediction of the models. But actually, in the early months of 2016 have already shown that. So we don't know how 2016 is going to continue. But that is a worrying problem.
Because Brian Cox, in saying predictions, is completely wrong. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was forced to drop the term predictions in its reports. It's not the correct term. It's not correct even to use forecasts. What they have to use, because they haven't got the data and the accuracy, is the word projections. So they're not predictions at all.
Of course. What would happen if we reach 2%?
Oh, there is some...
Now, let me point out, the presenter knew this was coming. That's Tony Jones, knew this was coming. And now he's tag teaming with Cox. It's 2-on-1, and I haven't even had a word in yet.
shocking predictions actually that you see where places in the Middle East, for example, that are already experiencing temperatures sometimes in excess of 50 degrees, I think, this year, become essentially uninhabitable for certain periods of time. So it exacerbates, sea level rise, etc. So what it does, it exacerbates some of the problems we're seeing. We just spoke about refugee problems. If you begin to get large...
So what problems are we seeing? He details not one. He doesn't even mention one specific problem. No one ever has shown us the claimed supposed problems. In 2000, or around 2000, they predicted 50 million climate refugees by 2010 or around there. The actual numbers? Nil. The actual numbers today? Nil. Do you remember when the first sentence Brian Cox said was he could give it evidence until he was blue in the face? Well, let's refer to Mikey Lezak's tweet at the bottom of the Q&A screen from the ABC. You've got to give him credit, Mikey Lee, for getting this one past the producers at the ABC. Could Cox really read out figures to his blue in the face? Now, that might just sound like a little snarky jab, yet it's actually quite an important thing to call out because it's a common trait of fake gurus and people who want to deceive. They promise to have all of the evidence they brag about, the mountains of money they have or the mountains of proof, yet if you ask to see it, they never actually show it to you.
Large shifts in climate very fast, then human populations have to respond. So how do you respond on very short timescales? One of the things you do is you move. So again, I emphasise it's the same answer as the answer to the last question, I think. This is now a clear global problem. The absolute consensus is that human action is leading to an increase in average temperatures. Absolute consensus. I know you may try to argue with that, but you can't.
No, not I will. Let's pause. Think about how many times Brian Cox said consensus. Absolute consensus. Consensus is just some people agreeing with each other. It's not evidence. The only use for consensus is when you're choosing what to get for lunch. Consensus is not scientific. In fact, it is evidence of politics. Objective data drives science. Consensus drives politics. Using consensus when you should be using science kills people. The number one killer of women after childbirth used to be fever. It killed 1 in every 6 women. In 1795, Alexander Gordon of Aberdeen, through the scientific method, concluded it was an infection spreading between infected people causing sepsis and fever. Women could be saved by proper hygiene and contamination protections. The consensus, though, said he was wrong. He was slapped down and treated as hostile. It took 125 years for the consensus to accept Alexander Gordon's conclusions were correct. Millions of women died needlessly because people used consensus instead of actual science. Clear global problems, Brian Cox? Where? Who's moving from country to country? I'll tell you who's moving. The rich people are moving to coastal houses. You have not defined a single problem.
But the key point is, can we respond to it? Do we have the political institutions and the political will and the organisation globally to respond to this challenge? And that worries me immensely. I don't think we do at the moment.
I'm going to go quickly to Malcolm Roberts. We want to hear from all the panellists on this.
Sure. The longest temperature record for temperatures on this planet is the Central England temperature record, which goes back to the mid-1600s. And the latest in the 17th century, the latest warming cycle in the 17th century going into the 18th century was faster and greater than the latest warming, which finished in 1995. And Justin Bieber wasn't flying his private jet around in the 1600s. That's the first thing. The second thing was we've had a pause in this so-called warming for now 21 years. Depends how you measure it, 21 years. And I'm absolutely stunned that someone who is inspired by Richard Feynman, a fantastic scientist who believes in empirical evidence, is quoting a consensus.
Can I just say...
There's a very important point here about the timescales. Whenever someone tells us temperatures have risen, we can ask, since when? They usually talk about the last 50 years. When we look at actual temperature measurements we have from thermometers, they go back hundreds of years. To go further back than that, we have to use ice cores, where methods are used to deduct what the temperature must have been. In both of these sets, there are temperatures that are warmer than we see today, far warmer. Climate alarmists argue these are the worst temperatures we've ever seen and the planet is boiling. Think about what they wouldn't want to show the whole picture. Why don't they show the whole picture? So we're at the 4-minute, 15-second mark of the video. I've had 1 minute and 15 seconds. Brian Cox has had 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Let's see if I'm allowed fair time with that interruption to get my second point in.
I brought the graph, right? I mean, can you I'll just tell you where the pause is. The pause that's often quoted. There's if you take this point here, which is about 1997, I think, and you ignore 2015 and 2016, you can choose that point and you can draw a slightly straighter trend line on there. But that's a misunderstanding. The question is, does that rise? And also, secondly, I'd brought another graph because I've heard it. Is it correlated with that, which is the graph that shows the CO2 emissions, the CO2 in parts per million in the atmosphere? And you see that peak there, where it goes flying up. So the question essentially is, first of all, are those two things correlated? And secondly, do we understand the physical mechanisms? And we understood those since the 19th century.
Brian Cox is using a manipulated data set for the temperature graph. It's based on, let's do that again. Brian Cox, for the temperature graph, is using a manipulated data set, and that's what he's basing the graph on. And we'll get to that in a second. But his own graph shows how ridiculous this is. Even he admits that you can draw a straighter trend line from 1995 to 2015. Think about what happened in that 20 years. The world had an unprecedented explosion in the total amount of hydrocarbons, fuel, diesel, oil, coal, being used, creating the biggest increase in human carbon production output ever. And the supposed rate of warming gets slower? I mean, come on. Carbon dioxide graph itself is made up splicing two different graphs, each with two different measurement methods. Ice cores for the first years, and then for the last jump, actual measurements from just 70 years. This is a huge no-no in science. On rare occasions, when you carefully and scientifically use two graphs side by side to make one graph, it's possible, providing it's disclosed. Brian Cox did not disclose that his graph was made from two separate data sets. He passed it off in a way that implies it's all one measurement. Its use here is unscientific, deceptive, and dishonest. And geologists show that past carbon dioxide levels have been far, far higher than today. 5 times higher in relatively recent geologically, and hundreds of times higher in the 700 million years ago. This is complete nonsense, and he's done a complete non-scientific approach here, and he's been deceptive in using that non-scientific approach.
Brian,
I can teach you. I can give you a lesson if you want. I can give you.
Can you go back to the middle of the graph there?
Yeah. That graph.
Yeah, the peak in the middle.
Yep.
What year is that?
That's about 1941.
Yeah, 1930s and 40s were warmer than the current decades. Where's that?
Well, no,
what's the data source?
Well, not exactly.
No, the original records.
Notice that Cox fails to ever state the source of his graph. This is a huge no-no in real science. Cox never tells us the scientific basis for his graph. He's not a scientist.
I don't know how we should argue about graphs.
The original records are far warmer. But the other thing that tells me that graph has got something wrong with it is that 1998 was about the same as 2015-16.
Okay, I'm just going to pause here. So you're hearing.
It was an El Nino year.
Both were El Nino years.
Malcolm, just 1 second. You're hearing the interpretation of a highly qualified scientist, and you're just saying, I don't believe it. Is that right?
Notice the logical fallacy here. Tony Jones, the compere, the presenter, uses an appeal to authority. He says Brian Cox is a highly reputable scientist. That means nothing. It's the actual data and the basis on which the data is based and the justification and the scientific credibility of that data. And Brian Cox has never gone to the scientific basis of that data. He's never gone to the actual source of the data. The fundamental thing in science is for a scientist making a proposal to table the data so that everyone can pick holes in it. He's not doing that. He's hiding it. Why is he hiding it? And I've, just from my understanding of manipulations in the past on the temperature data, I know that it's completely corrupted. Now, this is the part of the video that makes this video really famous.
I'm saying two things. First of all, that the data has been corrupted, and we know that the 1930s were warmer than today.
Yeah. Corrupted? What do you mean corrupted?
Been manipulated
By who?
By NASA. By the yes.
The people, hang on a minute. No, so this is quite serious.
No, I'm going to just ask the audience, just hang on. We've actually got to
Yes.
hear what's being said here. So it's all very well to laugh, but we want to hear what's being said.
So you might be asking at this point, what the hell am I talking about here? But this is where the scam all falls down, and there's a lot to unpack. Why are we even talking about NASA? Well, NASA just doesn't do rockets. They have a department within called the Goddard Institute of Space Studies. It's called GISS, G-I-S-S, Goddard Institute of Space Studies. The Goddard Institute of Space Studies republishes estimates of global surface temperature from the Global Historical Climate Network, the GHCN. That's the data that the United Nations uses for its climate claims and to spread unfounded climate alarm. These estimates are used to claim the world is boiling. The temperature data they published isn't the raw data. They take the measurements from thermometers, they put it through a data process that they call adjustment and homogenization, and a different set of temperatures comes out the other side that they then publish. This changes the raw temperature measurements. They say homogenization makes it more accurate, yet they won't disclose the models and the assumptions used for homogenization. That's not science. It's just a black box that the recorded temperatures go into, different temperatures come out of the other side, and no one's allowed to ask what's in the box. I call it manipulation. They call it homogenization.
He has shown the NASA figures, and the graph was originally showing that 1930s were warmer than recent decades, and that is correct. And people have recognised that for many, many years. And in the recent years, they've been reversed so that the 1930s were reduced in temperature and the later periods were inflated in temperature. That's a fact. Now, the Bureau of Meteorology is exactly the same. And Greg Hunt squashed an investigation of the Bureau of Meteorology earlier this year.
Okay.
Whenever independent analysis is done on the difference between the raw temperature data and the homogenized temperatures, the same conclusions are reached. In some kind of miracle, it just happens that homogenization results in adjusting past temperatures cooler and recent temperatures warmer, increasing or even creating a false warming trend. Let's look at a real-world example of what adjustment and homogenization in the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies temperature data looks like for a location here in Australia, Adelaide. The raw, unadjusted temperature record for the 140 years in Adelaide looks like this. The blue line is the average summer temperatures, red the average winter, and green the average for the year. All of them over the century are trending cooler. The hottest year was 1914 and the hottest summer was 1880. Then the data is adjusted and all of a sudden the actual cooling trend is reversed and becomes a warming trend. So what are the adjustments that are made? Everything before 1960 is adjusted cooler. Before 1940 is made cooler by a whole degree. That's huge. Just magic if you're trying to claim it's a hotter day today than it was 100 years ago. And we're not done yet. Now we need to put the raw data that's been adjusted to the homogenization black box. Yet again, the difference is more cooling in history than in recent years. So we go from a cooling trend, getting colder, half a degree per century in the raw data, to a warming trend of 0.6 of a degree in Adelaide in the manipulated result. This is repeated at locations across the world. It's manipulation. There's no other word for it. By the way, during Q&A program, I referred to Steve Goddard, who is actually Tony Heller. He's a scientist and an engineer in America with a worldwide reputation who did his initial work under the pen name Steve Goddard because he was afraid of being sacked for telling the truth and embarrassing the officials.
Can I just check you one thing? NASA. Now NASA,
Yes.
the people that landed men on the moon. I should just ask, actually, you believe we landed men on the moon? But,
See the little trick there?
That little trick is deflection. Instead of dealing with the facts and sticking to the argument, he's trying to change the subject completely and to distract the audience. And he's trying to smear. What the hell's this got to do with climate data? By the way, 150 NASA people, including astronauts, some had been to the moon, scientists, and senior managers of NASA, wrote to the then head of NASA claiming that the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies false claims and manipulations of data are hurting NASA's overall reputation.
no.
It's questioning whether or not I believe that I'm a moon skeptic. Now,
Are you?
No, I'm not.
Oh, right. No, but I mean, it's a serious accusation. I mean, the idea that NASA and presumably, I should say to people, by the way, that the Australian Academy of Science have done a brilliant. You can never get any sense on programs like this. They're adversarial and things. But the Science of Climate Change, the Australian Academy of Sciences report is superb. I brought it because I'm going to come and give it to you in a minute, so you can have a read. But that's very good if you want to see it. But the point is that the accusation that NASA, pretty all the Australian, the Met Office in the UK, everybody is collaborating to manipulate global temperature data.
Are you accusing me of saying they're collaborating?
I've personally held the Australian Academy of Science accountable for its dodgy reports. I've read their material on climate change. There's no empirical scientific data within logical scientific points that prove cause and effect. None. It is pure propaganda, paid for by the government. Why? Because the Australian Academy of Science relies on government funding. That's where it gets its money from. Chemical engineer, the late Will Steffen, was a climate alarmist who often presented false and unfounded climate claims. I've tangled with him publicly. He was on, and privately through correspondence. He could never provide the data that I requested. He was on the government payroll and on many government bodies pushing climate alarm. He often erroneously cited the Academy's climate publications, yet none of those publications presented empirical scientific data in logical scientific points that proved cause and effect that human carbon dioxide had to be cut. Not one.
What, they've all manipulated it in the same way and accidentally got to the same answer. Is that what you're saying?
NASA.
Notice how he's dodging the argument and going against the real scientific method. Every real scientist questions the data to ensure validity. It's clear Cox could not and did not and was not able to answer my questions. Basic fundamental scientific questions. A real scientist, unlike Cox, goes to the original data. Brian Cox's questions distract from him failing to answer my questions and that a real scientist would be able to answer easily. And a real scientist would have been keen to answer my questions.
NASA was led by James Hansen.
What about the Met?
Actually, James Hansen was head of NASA's climate outfit, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies at the time. His department was making many spurious, false and unfounded climate claims, and he became infamous for it around the world.
It's in the UK then.
Well, this could go around all night.
Well, no, it could, yes.
It could go around all night. I want to hear from Greg. Greg Hunt's been accused of stopping.
Why doesn't Brian Cox answer my question? Why doesn't he let me answer the questions? Let's have some facts on temperature data. There are 4 sets of temperature data around the world. The Hadley Centre in the UK Met Office. The USA has 2, NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And then the 4th set is the Japanese set. They used to be presented as independent. Scientists who knew what was going on knew they were all based on one data set. primarily the Global Historical Climate Network that the UN uses. NASA's Goddard Institute Space Director, who succeeded James Hansen, was Gavin Schmidt. And he inadvertently... NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies Director, Gavin Schmidt, who followed on from James Hansen when James Hansen retired. Gavin Schmidt inadvertently admitted to me in writing that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data in America and NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies data in America are based on the same underlying data set. After NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies and NOAA and Gavin Schmidt and James Hansen had denied that for many years. Same data.
An investigation into...
These are all experts in their field, and they advise us on what is real and what is not real. And as far as I'm concerned, where politics comes into play is how to implement their advice.
As far as
Some of you may remember Greg Hunt from more recent films, such as this one.
The world is engaged in the largest clinical trial, the largest global vaccination trial ever, and we will have enormous amounts of data. But what's the message for the public? It's safe, it's effective, it will help protect you, but it will also help protect your mum and dad, your grandparents, your nonna, all of Australia.
In my opinion, he was by far the worst health minister in history when he took over the response to COVID. Although, to be fair, he probably wasn't the one really behind the decisions. He was just following the plan, following the orders. Before his, how could you describe it, stunning achievements as health minister, he was Environment Minister in 2015, which put him in charge of Australia's Bureau of Meteorology, the Bureau of Meteorology, or BOM, B-O-M. Like NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia was seriously and credibly accused of homogenisation being the reason there was a warming trend in their temperature data. The allegations were so serious, the Prime Minister's Department was going to establish an inquiry. It was Greg Hunt in 2015 who proudly admitted he killed the review into temperature data adjustment and homogenisation. Greg Hunt then went on to implement the safeguard mechanism, Australia's first form of punishment tied to carbon dioxide credits, the basis for a future global carbon dioxide emissions trading scheme, a carbon dioxide tax. He couldn't have a review questioning whether the climate crisis was founded on accurate data when he was creating what's now a $5.5 billion carbon dioxide credit racket. He was the leading agent of the COVID scam after being a leading agent of the climate scam. I guess it shouldn't be a surprise. In Geneva, Greg Hunt was the Director of Strategy for the World Economic Forum in 2000 and 2001, and the World Economic Forum awarded him as a global leader for tomorrow. Yes, the World Economic Forum, those guys, an association of parasitic billionaires seeking to control the world's energy and seeking to transfer wealth through climate alarm.
Should be based on empirical evidence. All policy should be based on empirical evidence. I've heard consensus, which is not science. I've heard appeals to authority, which is not science. I've heard various illusions. Hang on. I've heard... hang on. Hang on, Brian. You showed me a graph of temperature.
Yeah, but I can show you.
You showed me a graph of temperature, but no one has ever explained cause and effect. What is important in science...
One of your
inspirers is Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman says it doesn't matter how beautiful, how emotional your theory. If the evidence does not suit, it is wrong. That's what Richard Feynman says. And what we need is not just empirical evidence.
Can I have 1 minute?
We need empirical... Hang on.
Yeah,
we need empirical evidence that demonstrates and proves cause and effect. Greg Hunt says he relies on advice. I have never, ever heard Greg Hunt say that he relies on data.
Now, Brian, you asked for a minute, and you wanted to respond to
a broader point about how you would do science and this issue in general. So it's obviously a sensible, as you said, a very important question to ask. What will our climate be like? Which is essentially the probability of weather. What's it going to be like in 2050 and 2100 under different scenarios, given that we understand the physical mechanism for greenhouse warming, etc. I mean, you were right in one thing you said, which is that CO2 is essential for life. It is. The temperature on the surface of the Earth would be very low, below freezing, if it wasn't for the fact that we had a greenhouse effect. You see that on Venus as well. So we understand the physical mechanisms. But the point is, it's a legitimate question and a very important question to ask. What if we carry on emitting greenhouse gases at this rate, or an increased rate or a decreased rate, what do we think will be the impact on the climate in 50 years' time?
We can only answer that.
I asked him the question, what is science and where's the empirical scientific data? Brian Cox changed that to his own question. His question was, what will our climate be like? I didn't ask that question. Why did he do that? Because he hasn't got the data. He reinforced his question twice to make sure the audience thought that was the question when it wasn't. In my experience with climate alarmists and in other fields, people change the question and fail to answer the question they were actually asked when they cannot answer it. Brian Cox raised Venus, and he's correct in that because Venus's atmosphere has a high concentration of carbon dioxide. So does Mars. Mars' atmosphere has a very high concentration of carbon dioxide. And Mars is a lot cooler than Earth. Carbon dioxide has nothing to do with it. That proves carbon dioxide is not the driver of atmospheric temperatures. Venus is closer to the sun than is Earth. Mars is further from the sun than is Earth. Venus has a much higher atmospheric pressure. That has a lot to do with the temperature gradient. Venus's atmosphere is vastly different from Earth's. There's much less water vapor and far higher pressure, and that greatly increases temperature. Why didn't Cox tell us these things? And why didn't he tell us that Mars, with a very, very high concentration of carbon dioxide in its atmosphere, is actually cooler than Earth's temperature, Earth's atmosphere?
50 years' time.
We can only answer that question if we understand it now.
So, yes. So the way you do that is you make measurements now of temperatures, sea levels, Arctic ice volume, etc., etc., etc. And then you try and model the climate in order to make a prediction about the future. Now, that's the only way that you can make a prediction about the future. There is no other way. So you can check the model.
Predictions are not empirical scientific data. The United Nations climate projections were initially called predictions or forecasts. Then experts reminded the UN, as I said earlier, the UN authors, that the UN cannot meet the criteria for calling their projections forecasts and predictions. The UN lacks the data, lacks the accuracy, lacks the confidence to call them predictions. The UN had to change and use the weak, almost meaningless term of projections. It means nothing.
Brian, the models have already been proven wrong, hopelessly wrong.
Well, no.
Yes, they have.
And finally, he finishes on models. Computer models. Models are not evidence. They're certainly not empirical scientific data. They aren't data or facts at all. They're a forecast, a projection, maybe. The weatherman uses models to say whether or not it's going to rain tomorrow, and the weatherman still gets it wrong just the day in advance. We're meant to believe some people know what's going to happen in 100 years based off their models. It's nonsense. And note that the models, the CSIRO models, the UN models, NASA's Goddard Institute Space Study models, have never been validated. And that's essential before the term model can be used. It's not a model of anything. Models that have already and always been proven erroneous, wrong.
They've already been proven wrong, hopelessly wrong.
Well, no.
Yes, they have.
You cross-check them into the past, for example, they do quite nicely. They have a large but actually shrinking error range on them.
Here's yet another furphy from Brian Cox. He fails to mention that the models have never been validated, ever, and that cross-checking with the past was done after adjusting the models against the past. They didn't fit the past, so they're fine-tuned to fit the past, which destroys their being based upon the assumptions that they're stated to have been based on. They were based on being tweaked.
But the question is, if you don't do that, if you don't model, which is a central part of the scientific process, how do you go about answering the question, which, as you said, our young people here have a right to ask, which is, what will the world be like in 2050, in 2075, in 2100? If you don't model it, this is my question to you, if you don't model it, how can you go about trying to answer the question?
Notice how he continues to avoid my question to provide the empirical scientific data within logical scientific points, proving that human carbon dioxide warms the planet and must be cut using controls on our use of hydrocarbon fuels and energy, using taxes on the people and giving subsidies to parasitic billionaires. The fundamental basis for policy has to be the effect of carbon dioxide from human activity on climate. No one has ever quantified that. You cannot build a model until that is quantified. You cannot make any predictions, projections, forecasts, nothing. You can't even guess until you know that. No one anywhere in the world has ever quantified the effect of human carbon dioxide on any aspect of temperature of climate at all.
And to answer the question.
The models that the IPCC uses are unvalidated and erroneous and have already been proven hopelessly wrong. And that's a fact.
That wasn't my question.
I gave you a fair go.
How would you go about answering the question?
You answer the question by making projections based on models, providing the models are validated and have been proven to be accurate. And the models have already been proven to be inaccurate, and the IPCC has recognised that and admitted it. Now, what we need to do is look at the empirical data, and the empirical data says quite categorically that the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are a result of temperature changes.
No, that's flat out wrong.
No, it's not. That's correct.
It is flat out
I've looked at the data.
He repeatedly fails to specify where he claims I'm wrong. There is no evidence of error on his, no evidence on his part of any error on my part. He repeatedly fails to specify the data and the sources of his data.
Sorry, just hang on. He listened to you, and now you have to listen to him.
It is wrong. Let me just. All right, I'll just give you one snapshot. So I took a snapshot of the different bits of evidence for 2015. So global upper ocean heat content, highest on record in 2015. Global sea level, highest on record in 2015. 70 millimetres higher than that observed in 1993. Global surface temperature, highest on record. El Nino, something like a 10 to 40% contribution to that. And tropical cyclones, well above average overall. As you said, and even the anecdotal data. I actually had a wonderful.
He fails to address my fundamental point about changes in levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere following changes in temperature. And he provides indiscriminate pieces of data without providing any associated claims of cause and effect. And that's completely unscientific. Consider a few of his points. During ice ages, sea levels were many metres lower than today. The Great Barrier Reef has moved up and down 120 metres in the last 7,000 years. Peer-reviewed scientific papers show that over the last 5,000 years, oceans have cooled. Sea level measurements at many Australian cities reveal cyclical variation and overall flat trends, with clear jumps and falls since 1886. Tropical cyclone frequency and severity fluctuate naturally. At the time Brian Cox made his false claim, Australia and America were experiencing relatively low cyclone frequency and intensity. Both continued to be low compared with the past data recorded. Global temperatures are much cooler than past recent climate optimum periods here on Earth. And the record temperature for Australia was set in the town of Cloncurry in Queensland in 1889, 53.4 degrees centigrade. I think that's 128 Fahrenheit. Nothing's come even close to it since then. The longest temperature trend in Australian modern history in the last 170 years is a 40-year cooling period from 1930s to 1976, when the world embarked on massive industrialization and had a Second World War.
I was going to comment on a story then, but I won't do because it'll take too long. But as you said, so the point is you go evidence. Arctic continues to warm, sea ice extent low, Arctic land surface temperature in 2015, 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit above 1981 to 210 average.
The Arctic's Northwest Passage was opened in 1907. Amundsen sailed through. It was opened again in the 1940s. Temperatures vary naturally all over the Earth, in various regions and in various nations and in the Arctic. And they vary in decadal cycles with no overall modern warming. Citing temperature without context contradicts basic scientific principles. This man is a showman, not a scientist. Stating temperatures in isolation without showing the variation in temperatures is deceptive and misleading. Temperatures are varying naturally and inherently and cyclically, as they have for millennia.
1 to 210 average. But the point is, the key point is that if you don't accept that the only way to try to formulate policy on what we do with emissions is to build models, that's the only way you can predict the future. Otherwise, you have tarot cards.
First, and most importantly, we have to establish the baseline, and that needs empirical scientific data. Cox repeatedly fails to produce the key to science, empirical scientific data within logical scientific points. The only basis for policy is empirical scientific data and logical scientific points and proof of cause and effect, including the measured claim of the effect of human carbon dioxide on elements of climate. No one in Australia, as I said before, has ever done that. No one in the world has ever done that.
Just before you come in, Malcolm, I'm going to interrupt because I want to hear from...
In the ABC studios immediately after the show, I went up to Brian Cox and introduced myself and offered to send him data and other materials. He agreed. I invited him to identify any errors in my material, and if there are any errors, to get back to me. He acknowledged. I sent him the data. I never heard from him. I wonder why. So let me challenge Brian Cox to a debate on climate science and on the corruption of climate science. I'd love to hear from you, Brian Cox. Over to you.